Test, we on? Good, okay. So, obviously I'm not Steve. Steve's sick, so Psalms class will start next week. So I'm going to be teaching in the NPR this quarter, but they asked me to kind of fill in for both tonight. So if you're here for Steve's class, it'll start next week in here. My class will be in the NPR. Quick announcement, if you're able to help set up the NPR for the potluck on Sunday, as far as setting up the chairs and the table, if you can go in there after class, it would be helpful. Okay, so what I'm teaching on is Moses, kind of like a biography of Moses, and it's going to be a little bit different class than probably what you're used to. If you were in the class with me last quarter, that class was slightly intended to kind of prep for this class, and this class is slightly intended to prep for potentially another class. So it kind of keeps going. But with this class, tonight we'll have some Bible in it, but a lot of the weeks it's actually things that we know about Moses that aren't in the Bible. Things that maybe you've never heard of before, you don't know anything about, to kind of help shed light on who Moses was and why Moses was uniquely positioned to be really the only human that could have done the things that he did, and why God prepared him in the way God prepared him so that he could do those things. And tonight we're just going to basically try to accomplish one task, and that is to answer the question, when did Moses live? I can't really read it very well from back here. So to answer the question, when did he live, you really have to establish when did the Exodus occur and when did the Conquest occur. And by what I mean by the Conquest is when did they go into Canaan to start taking the cities. So if you can figure out the dates for those two events, then you can figure out when Moses lived. The problem in academic circles is there's multiple different dates for when these things could have occurred. And probably the historically most popular one, which I'll touch on briefly tonight, but we'll talk more about later on, is one that would be in the 1200s. But most conservative scholars and most conservative circles have now gone with a different date, and it actually matches up with the Bible much better. So the one that most critics of the Bible go with and most more liberal scholars go with, it actually doesn't match up with the Bible, and they say, see, the Bible is false, or the Bible's wrong. Well, the reason they're wrong is because maybe they have the wrong date, and then therefore their date doesn't match up with anything the Bible says. And so what we're going to look at tonight is the more conservative scholarly viewpoint on when did these events occur. And tonight we're going to just look at passages from the Bible itself to see, well, when does the Bible say that this actually occurred? Okay, so one thing I'll just mention briefly, and we'll come back to this later on, but we'll throw it out there for now. So Jacob moved to Goshen, as mentioned in Genesis 45. I can barely read it. They moved to Goshen when Joseph was already in Egypt and there was the drought in Canaan. Jacob and the rest of the family moved to Egypt, and they settled in an area called Goshen. And, you know, when you kind of think of Goshen, you kind of assume it's maybe desertish, particularly if you fall back to the old movie of Moses and you think about that, but it actually isn't desert at all. It's in part of the Nile Delta. It's a very lush area, especially back at that time. It's a little bit different now because the Delta River tributaries have some have dried up and they've changed. So, but where this was at the time was a very lush area. So that would have been about 1876 BC, and they lived there for 400 years. But we'll come back to that later on. Okay, so we'll look at 6 biblical verses from various time frames of biblical writing to see if they agree on the date of the Exodus and the Conquest. Skeptics claim that each of these passages are wrong for precise dating, for multiple different reasons. And as we look at each verse, I'll talk about the reasons why they say it's wrong. But if all these passages say the same thing, then is there something to it? And none of these authors lived simultaneously, so you can't make the argument that they colluded together to concoct some crazy scheme, okay? Well, I take that back. Two of the passages are both from the same author, but the rest of them are from different authors that lived at different times. Okay, so the first passage is 1 Kings 6:1, and I have it on the screen. All these verses tonight will be from the ESV if I put them up on the screen. So it says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So what this is talking about is what year did Solomon start building the temple? And that date is agreed upon by everybody. Nobody really disputes that date. And so what this passage is saying is the temple started to be built 480 years after the Exodus, okay? So the date for the temple building for Solomon, it started in either 966 or 967. And you can go with either one, but it's agreed upon by even liberal scholars will agree with this date. So this date is not really disputed or argued. And so if you subtract 480 back from 966, you end up with the Exodus occurring in 1446 BC. One little caveat to that, the Septuagint, which if you don't know, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, written before Jesus, and it was the Bible, the Old Testament Bible for the Jews at the time of Jesus, as well as the early church. It says 440 years instead of 480 years, but regardless, you're still in the same ballpark time frame, okay? So if you use those dates, you get an Exodus date of 1446. Now, what do skeptics say about this? Well, they say it's not a literal 480 years. They say 480 is 12 times 40. The 40 years represents an idealized generational period, and the 12 represents 12 ideal generations. So if you multiply 12 times 40, you get 480. But the problem with that is every scholar agrees that a generation is not 40 years, it's 25 years, especially in Bible times. Could you imagine all of us not having kids till we're 40, especially in biblical times, which most people got married, at least most females got married when they were about 15, and most men when they're about 20 to 25. So to say that your first child would be born at 40 is slightly ridiculous under those terms. So they agree that a generation is about 25 years for the Old Testament particularly. And so if you do that math, then you say 25 times 12, it gives you 300 years, and that puts you in the middle of what would be the 13th century BC, so about 1230 to 1266, somewhere in that range. So liberal scholars will all say that, or most of them will say, the Exodus occurred around 1230 BC. That is their date. Whereas what we're presenting is the Exodus is around the mid-1400s BC. Okay, so it's about 200 and some odd years different in the dating. Okay, so that's the first verse. Okay, the next one is Judges 11:26. And this is Jephthah talking to the king of Ammon. And he says, while Israel lived in Heshbon and its villages, and in Aroer and its villages, and in the cities that are on the banks of Arnon, 300 years, why did you not deliver them within that time? What he's talking about, they're basically arguing over some territory. And so what Jephthah is saying is, we've lived here for 300 years, and we've had this land for 300 years, and nobody's ever made an issue out of it. And now you're going to come in here and claim that we stole your land, even though we've been on this land for 300 years. That's what the argument is about. But the point of what this is saying is Jephthah is saying, we've been here at this point for 300 years already, okay? And so, wow, that shows up really bad. So the area he's talking about is the area circled on the map on the left. The Arnon River is a little river that comes off the Dead Sea on the right-hand side of the eastern side of the Dead Sea, which is in part of the territory of Ammon, or where Ammon and Moab kind of come together. And so they're squabbling about some land there on that side of the Dead Sea, which is what I'm trying to show you with the two maps. But as I can tell now, you can't see that at all. So sorry about that. But anyway, that's the point. So the dates for the judges, and you could squibble over this a little bit, but Jephthah would be roughly around 1100 BC. And so if Jephthah is saying we've been here for 300 years, then if you add 300 years to 1100 BC, then that would be 1400 BC. And so that would be when he's saying they've already been in the land at that point, so that would mean that they've already gone in and started conquering part of the land at that point. So Jephthah is saying that the conquest would be roughly around 1400 BC. So what do skeptics say to that? Well, they just say that Jephthah is just a redneck hillbilly from the highland part of Israel, and he doesn't know anything about the chronology of all this, and he's just throwing out a number to say that we've been here a long time. But Jephthah's number magically matches up with all the other numbers. So is he just an idiotic hillbilly that doesn't know anything, or is he actually speaking the truth? And we'll see as we put all this together, maybe he's speaking the truth. Okay, the next one is 1 Chronicles 6:33 through 37. So if anybody was in the class I taught last quarter, does anybody remember when Chronicles was written? It's the last book written in the Old Testament. So if you actually look in the Hebrew Bible, they have the exact same text that we have, but they're arranged differently, and Chronicles is the last book in the Jewish Bible, whereas for us it's slapped in with right after Kings, so it's not really chronologically correct in terms of when it was written as where it appears in our Bible. So it was the last Old Testament book actually written, and it was probably written in the 400s BC. And a lot of people think Ezra is the one who wrote it. So the first ones I showed you, Kings, not really sure who wrote Kings. A lot of people speculate Samuel wrote it, so if that's the case, that would be around 1000 BC. Judges also would have been written roughly around that time frame. So now we're about 600 years farther down the road for this writer, and let's see if this writer says the same thing. So what this is about, this is a big long genealogy about a guy named Haman, not the same Haman from the Esther story. And so what you have to do with this for this to make any sense is you have to track back from Haman to Moses, and if you do that, it's 18 generations. And then you have to add one generation for Solomon. So basically you're looking at a time frame of 19 generations, okay? And if you say a generation is 25 years, then what you're saying is 19 times 25 is 475 years. If you add 475 to when the temple was built, which everybody agrees on that date as 966, then you get the time for the Exodus is roughly 1441 BC. Okay, so it's basically the same as what the other writers are saying. Okay, but if you try to use the late date theory, which says the Exodus is in 1230 BC, and you apply the same logic, then you would say a generation is only 15 years. And that's a little hard to argue that a generation is 15 years if you can imagine every firstborn being born to someone at 15 years of age for each consecutive generation, and that's very unlikely. So again, the chronicler seems to match up with the author of Judges and the author of 1 Kings. Okay. All right, Ezekiel, I will admit, as I was looking at this one didn't quite add up to me quite as well, but I'll show it to you anyway. And I may have to go back and look at some of this. So don't really worry about the Ezekiel passage. It's a little confusing. You have to kind of pair this with an extra biblical source. What Ezekiel's talking about, Ezekiel's giving you some exact dates on when they were in captivity, okay, in Babylon. But, oh, wait, what did I do? How did I get to here? Oh, I'm going the wrong way, my bad. Okay. So, what Ezekiel may be referring to is a Jubilee cycle. And a Jubilee cycle is every 49 years, and then year 50 is when everything resets. So there is a extra-biblical writing from the 2nd century AD by a Jewish rabbi, and you can see his name up there. It's called the Seder Olam writings. And basically what he is saying, if you look at what he's talking about, he's basically saying that there's 16 Jubilee period cycles if you start at year 622 and you go backwards. So the first Jubilee cycle is when they went into Canaan, I believe. And so there should be 16 cycles in between that and the year 622. So if you do the math on that, 622 plus 784 for the 16 cycles would stick you at a conquest date of 1406, which matches up exactly with these other passages. Now the skeptics will just say that Ezekiel's confused, it's just dumb luck that he said this, basically, okay? All right, and now we're going to the New Testament. So there's going to be two passages in the New Testament. They're both in Acts. And this is Stephen's speech in Acts 7, and Stephen is giving kind of a history of the Jews to the Jewish leaders before they stone him to death, and because they don't like what he has to say. And he says, at this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. Now, when 40 years had passed, and an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in a flame of fire in a bush. So basically the point of this verse is that it shows that he lived in Midian for 40 years. Okay, so if you then compare that with these two Exodus passages about what God said to Moses, and I'm going to have to turn because I can't read it from here. Moses lived in Midian for 40 years after he fled Egypt. So if you look at Exodus 2:23, what happened was the king of Egypt died. So it says, during these many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. So what this is talking about, there is this Pharaoh is called the Pharaoh of the oppression. And what that means is this particular Pharaoh lived a really long time, okay? And he oppressed the Jews and put them in slavery. And so this Pharaoh would have been Pharaoh when Moses left Egypt, because remember, Moses was afraid that after he killed the Egyptian, he would be punished for killing the Egyptian. And so he fled, and he had to stay gone from Egypt as long as that particular Pharaoh was still alive, because if he came back into Egypt while that Pharaoh was alive, he would have probably been executed, okay? So he has to stay gone for at least 40 years, or however long this particular Pharaoh lives. And you look at Exodus 4:19, and it says the same thing. So this is it's not Jesus, this is God talking to Moses, and he says, and the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are now dead. So which Pharaoh is this? And this is kind of I don't want to give this away because it's kind of a spoiler for a future class, but you have to look at all the pharaohs and see who actually would match up with this description. Well, there's only 2 pharaohs in all of this time frame between the 1500s and the 1200s that has a reign that lasts over 40 years. And one of those is Ramses II, which is what a lot of people think is the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and he would be the Pharaoh for the 1230 Exodus date, okay? And so from that standpoint, it might match up, but there are other details that makes it not match up. And so there is another Pharaoh that had a long reign that could be the Pharaoh of the oppression, that I won't say who that is yet. But it seems to match up with what is being said here. So basically what you have is, Moses kills an Egyptian, he has to flee, and then he has to God has him stay gone until that Pharaoh dies. And once that Pharaoh dies and all the people associated with that Pharaoh die, then he can come back into Egypt and not be impeded. Okay, and then the last verse is Acts 13, 19 to 20, and this is Paul talking at this point. And he says, after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. All this took about 450 years, and after that he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. So he's talking about something happening that took 450 years. And notice he says the word about, so he's not being super precise. This is more of an estimate, okay? So what he's talking about is the time from when Jacob entered Egypt until the conquest, okay? Now, Jacob entered Egypt around 1876, and the conquest would be about 1406, roughly. So the precise total is really about 470 years, but Paul says about, so he says about 450, okay? So he's giving a little bit more of an estimate. So when you look at these 6 verses collectively, what does the Bible say about when the Exodus occurred and when the conquest occurred? Well, here's a summary of the 6 verses. So 1 Kings 6:1 says the Exodus occurred in 1446. Judges 11:26 says the conquest was around 1400 BC. So remember from the biblical account, you have the Israelites leave Egypt, and then they go out into the wilderness and do a lot of foolishness, and God punishes them by making them wander for 40 years, right? So the Exodus is going to occur at a date, and then 40 years later is when they're going to actually go into Canaan, and that's what I mean by the conquest. So there should be 40 years between the Exodus and the conquest beginning. So Judges 11:26 says the conquest is around 1400, roughly. First Chronicles says 1441, roughly, for the Exodus. Ezekiel says about 1446. Acts we'll come back to, but I'll just tell you now it says the same thing. And Acts 13 says the conquest is around 1400 BC. So, when was the Exodus and the conquest? Per the Bible, the Exodus is in 1446 BC, and the conquest is in 1406 BC. So when you work all that backwards, when did Moses live? Moses was born in 1526 BC and died in 1406 BC, okay? So the character we're going to be talking about most of the rest of the class, then, that would be when he lived, okay? So 1526 to 1406. So as we go forward in the class, what we're going to start doing, not this week, but in general, is start exploring what was happening in the world during this time frame and what events would have occurred that would have shaped Moses into becoming the person that he was, so that he could be the person to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and could be the person that wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So that by learning all that, it will give you more confidence that what the Bible actually says is true. Because we're living in an age when people say the Bible is nothing but fairy tales and myths, and don't believe it. Even biblical scholars will try to tell you that. And what we're hoping to learn in this class is it's not fairy tale and myth, and very factually correct, and you can actually look at stuff outside the Bible to prove it's factually correct. Okay, so those are your dates. Exodus 1446, Conquest 1406, and so Moses would have lived between 1526 and 1406. Now, just to be clear up front, this is somewhat subjective, okay? So I'm not telling you this is 100% true. I'm telling you this is a generally well-received conservative viewpoint on these dates, but I can't promise you it's 100% accurate. Nobody can say that for sure, okay? But this is generally considered by conservative scholars to be the most likely dates, okay? All right, so when did Moses live? Well, is there any archaeology evidence that might corroborate what we just covered with the Bible? And we're just going to talk about four things real quick. These four things: Avaris, the Sinai 375A inscription, Amarna letters, and the Soleb inscription. So Avaris is just another word for Goshen that we talked about a minute ago. So in Genesis 47:11, the Israelites settled in the land of Goshen in Egypt during the lifetime of Jacob. So Jacob would have come into the land roughly around 1876 when you subtract around 400 years after or back from the Exodus, roughly. So they're going to live there for about 4 centuries. It's in the Nile Delta. It's not in the desert. Okay, so this is a very nice part of Egypt. I was going to try to put a picture on here. I ran out of time. You know, when I teach in the side room, nobody really cares how nice my slides are. But when I came in here tonight, I figured I better spice things up a bit. But I ran out of time, so I didn't get a picture of this on here. But if you just remember, you remember the Mississippi Delta. You know, the land's really nice and fertile down as you get by the coast, and it's the same with the Nile. So you know, in Egypt, most of it's desert except the part along the Nile, and then as the Nile gets to where it empties into the Mediterranean Sea, you have a delta, and that delta is all very lush, particularly when it floods, which it always floods in the flood season. So this is where Goshen would have been. In archaeology terms, it's called Avaris, and another name, the Arabic name for it is Tel El Daba. Excuse me. They have excavated it. I'll show you this in a second. Well, actually, it's there. So there's an Austrian archaeologist named Manfred Bietak who's been doing archaeology work there for the last 30 years. And he is not, I don't know this, I don't think he's a Christian. He's definitely not coming at this from a biblical standpoint. He's just coming at it from an archaeology standpoint. But everything that he has found is going to corroborate what the Bible says. So what he has found at Avaris is a palace, so a royal palace, a lot of military structures. The Navy was launched from there, for instance. So it's a very lush place, a very rich place. So it's not like the Israelites are just living out in the slums or out in the desert somewhere. Let me just say this. So I didn't really think I'd get this far tonight, so I didn't add this in. So when the Jews first moved to Egypt, or when Jacob and his family first moved to Egypt, and then they became more populated over time and became a kind of a sub-nation within the nation of Egypt, they actually, for about the first 300 years, the Egyptians left them alone and let them be sort of like normal citizens, so to speak, there. And so they had a lot of business, or some businesses they ran. Two main businesses, and I keep doing this, let me go back. Two main businesses they ran were mining. They did a lot of mining, which I'll show you a reference to that in a second. The other business they did was wine, which may surprise you a little bit. They imported wine from Canaan. So they brought in large quantities of wine and worked as the middleman to sell it to the Egyptians. So that's some of what the Israelites did while they were living there. And so for about the first 300 of the 400 years, the Egyptians coexisted with them fine. And then the last 100 years is when they put them under oppression and made them slaves. And there's a reason for that I will try to touch on in a week or two. It's going to take a little bit more explanation than what we have time for tonight. But there's a reason why it went from them coexisting fine to not coexisting fine that we don't have time to talk about right now. Okay, so previously people thought Memphis was the only government seat, but now they know that Avaris also had government facilities. So, for instance, when Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron to come to the palace at night, well, Memphis would be a long way away, so there's absolutely no way you could get from Avaris to Memphis on the same day if the Pharaoh called you there. But the reason they were able to do it is because Pharaoh had a palace in Avaris. So it's just like crossing the street. Pharaoh wants to see you. Okay, well, I'll just walk over there. So that's why they were able to like go back and forth so easily to talk to Pharaoh. So Betok also found that in the 15th century BC, which is the 1400s that we're talking about, there is what's called an abandonment phase during this time. And what that means is there is clear archaeological evidence that there were Semitic people living in Avaris for a long period of time, and then suddenly it just stopped. And then there's nobody living there anymore, okay? And so the population just completely disappears, and nobody lived there again. And so what they think has happened is, this matches up with the biblical account. These people that were living there, they suddenly packed up and they left, and nobody lived there again. Well, there are several things that corroborate this dating. One is there's a lot, they found pottery there, and the pottery there matches two pharaohs, and it's the two pharaohs from the 1400s, okay? So that's one. Two, they found a ton of animal bones, and the animals match up exactly with the animals mentioned in Exodus that they used to slaughter, particularly sheep and goats, which was a lot of the animal bones. So that all matches up with the Exodus story. I shouldn't say story like it's a made-up story, but you know what I mean, the Exodus account. So that all matches up, and there's one other detail I was going to mention. Well, that's good enough for now. Anyway, the point being, they disappeared and then nobody lived there anymore. And why they not live there anymore? Because after they left, the Egyptians, this is a little bit of speculation, but the Egyptians may have considered that site unholy because of all of the wrath that was brought upon them because of the Israelites, that they didn't want to go touch or live in that land anymore. So they considered that area unholy, and so that's why the archaeological record just suddenly stops and nobody else lived there. Okay, so you have this lush area in Egypt that just mysteriously nobody lived there anymore. And so that corroborates or goes along with the Exodus account. Okay, the Sinai 375A inscription, this is obviously found in a place called Sinai, which is the Sinai Peninsula, which is part of Egypt. It was discovered in 1905 by Sir Flanders Petrie. It's located at Sarabit el-Karim in the Sinai Peninsula, and it shows a transition from a pictograph script to an alphabetic type script, but that part doesn't really matter as much as what it supposedly says based on Petrovich, by a translation of it by a guy named Petrovich. So Petrovich says that it says, the overseer of minerals, Ahisamach, okay? So what is it talking about? Well, remember I said a minute ago, two of the main industries that the Jews did while they were there, one of them was mining. And so this is found in a mine in the Sinai Peninsula. I think it's just written on the wall of the mine, if I remember right. And so who is this Ahisamach that would be from 1480 BC? Well, if you go to Exodus 31:6, you'll read the name of Ahisamach, and it's his son that is being put over some construction or something. I can't remember exactly the details of it. But the point is Ahisamach is found on an inscription on a wall in the Sinai Peninsula. I think it's in the mine. And it may be the exact same individual who is mentioned in Exodus 31:6 as the father of someone who was part of the Exodus themselves, okay? So Ahisamach wasn't necessarily part of the Exodus. He may have been dead, but his son was part of the Exodus. So if he lived in 1480 and you drop about 40 years off that to 1446, then it would make sense that his son could have been part of the Exodus about 30 to 40 years later. All right, Amarna tablets, I could say a lot about this. I've done some research on these. These are very interesting tablets. They were discovered, I think, in the late 1800s. They're also from Egypt. They're from, I don't think the city, I don't think is Amarna. Amarna is the name of the Bedouin tribe, so it was named after it. So it was found in their territory. So these are a bunch of tablets. There's about 280 of them. They're letters written from most of them are written from Canaan. So if you remember from the Exodus account, from Joshua's account, when the Jews go into Canaan, they conquer a bunch of different city-states. So it's not like Canaan is one country and they have a centralized government. What it is each major city is its own entity. And so they have to fight against each one of them individually. And so the main players are going to be Lachish and Jerusalem and Ai, it's I, but Ai if you want to call it that. Lachish, Hatzor is another one. And so these, the kings or leaders of these countries are writing letters back to Pharaoh. Now, why would they do that? Well, let me back up and explain what's going on. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the coming week, but you remember I told you there's some Pharaoh that lived before the Exodus that had a long reign, right? That Pharaoh, if it's the one that I will present to you, as he likely is, he was the most expansionist Pharaoh of all the pharaohs, and he did a lot of campaigns out into that part of the world. And one place he did a lot of campaigns in particular was Canaan, okay? And so during his reign, so the Pharaoh right before the Exodus, during his reign, he went in and cleaned house in Canaan, and Canaan all became under Egyptian rule, okay? So all of those little city-states you read about in Joshua, they function as vassal kingdoms of Egypt, okay? And so they are writing letters back to Egypt saying, we are your loyal servant, but somebody is invading us. You need to send help to help us, or you're going to lose all your little city-states here in Canaan because we can't fight against these people. And so these letters are written in the late 1300s. So remember, with this model, the conquest starts in 1406 BC. These letters would be written roughly about 30 years later, while Joshua and them are still taking some of these areas. And so what they're saying is, we have these people that are attacking us. We can't withstand these attacks. You better do something about it, or you're no longer going to control this territory. And some of them actually just ended up leaving Egypt altogether, and they ended up siding with the Israelites. And you can read about that in Joshua, where they just said, we're not going to fight against you, we'll just join you. And with Hatzor being one of them in particular, which was the main city in Canaan, was Hatzor. It was the biggest single kingdom of all the little city-state kingdoms. And so they just ended up just siding with Israel. But that's what these letters are about. So these letters kind of corroborate that, and maybe next week we'll talk a little bit more about this term. But the Canaanite rulers refer to these foreigners as the Habiru, okay? Now, immediately, without giving it much thought, what does that word sound like? Hebrews, okay? It's a little more complex than that. I don't have time to fully talk about it tonight. Somebody remind me next week, and I'll explain what that term means. Loosely speaking, that term means, at least some scholars will say, the term means a band of marauders. It's not like a centralized single country. It's a group of bandits, marauders, that kind of stuff. there's some reasons why it can mean that. It's not a specific term for the Hebrews per se, but in the context of what is happening here, are they using this term to refer to the Hebrews? And we can talk a little bit more about that next week. But it's interesting that they use this word, and they use it over and over and over again in these letters. Okay. The Soleb Hieroglyph is located in ancient Nubia, which is part of modern-day Sudan. But at the time, Nubia was controlled by Egypt. So all these sources are coming from ancient Egypt. And what it says is it refers to the land of the Shasu of Yahweh, and it's dated to the 14th century BC. And so what it is saying is the Egyptian Pharaoh, and it's on something that the Pharaoh had written, so it's not like chicken scratch on a wall somewhere. This is something Pharaoh had constructed to kind of document some of his exploits. And so it refers to a group of people living in Canaan that worshiped a god named Yahweh in the early 1300s. So if there's a group of people living in Canaan in the 1300s that worship Yahweh, who does that sound a whole lot like? Sounds a whole lot like the Israelites, right? So remember, the conquest would have started in 1406, so by the time you're into the mid-1300s, the Israelites would have already been in the land, and they would have already taken a lot of this territory. Now remember, whose land are they taking? It's Egypt's land, okay? Yes, you have the king of Hatzor and the king of Jerusalem and all that, but they're all vassals of Egypt, okay? So why did Egypt not do anything about it? Why did they just let them take it? It's probably because, and I'd have to show you the map, Egypt didn't care that much about that part of the land. And what do I mean by that? And I know it's the second bell, so I'll just say this real quick. What the Israelites were taking is what is called the highlands, but they didn't take the part down on the coast by the Mediterranean Sea, okay? So the Egyptians didn't really care about the highlands. They cared about the part down on the sea. Well, why did they care about the part on the sea and not the highlands? Because the part down on the sea is the highway that leads you from Egypt to Mesopotamia, which is the trade route. So as long as the trade route, or you think about it like the interstate, as long as the interstate's still flowing and the trade's still going up and down the interstate, you don't really care what's going off over here on the side, okay? So as long as the Israelites weren't fooling with the trade route, the Egyptians didn't really care. And so when did the Israelites actually capture the part down by the coast? It wasn't until David, 400 years later, okay? So that's why, they're writing to Egypt, asking for Egypt for help, and Egypt's just like, whatever. We still got the trade going. We're fine. All right, any questions? All right. Steve will be back next week.